Tonight's topic, of course, is Pacific Northwest up in smoke, wildfires, forests, and climate change. Actually, I'm going to start off with Nivis here. So Nivis, in your article in The Hill, you suggested that environmental groups and timber companies should work together to come up with some creative solutions. And I'm just kind of curious if you think that that's actually feasible. We've all heard about issues between foresters and environmental groups in terms of the spotted owl and other issues. Do you think that's feasible? Is there precedent for that?
This is absolutely feasible. And we've seen precedents in many environmental issues, including forestry. In forestry, we have two voluntary programs. One is Forestry FSI. Forgetting what FSI stands for, but that's not the one I want to talk about. That's the one that industry by itself wrote. And then there is a voluntary program in terms of determining how forest should be cut, how forest should be managed. And that is Sustainable Forest Initiative, SFI, which was developed with an environmental NGO and with the industry together. So we already have a precedent, and it's in the very same industry that we're talking about. So yes, absolutely, it can be done because it has been done. We also have examples in other areas such as sustainable fishing, sustainable aquaculture, and so on. But we definitely have it in forestry.
So this next question, I think, is for Brian. So Brian, we obviously in Western Washington in particular, we have a lot of managed forests, and we also have we have large national parks, and those things it's a mosaic. We have national parks and managed forests together, and I'm wondering if that complicates issues around wildfires and the management of those forests, and what we do in case of wildfires, and what do you think about that?
Okay. The question about how different land management contexts interact with forest fires is a challenging one because it's very obvious with things like smoke, not knowing any borders, but even fires very often management boundaries. I'm just going to give up on this microphone here.
Drop the mic.
Drop the mic. And so, I mean, one thing that I think is helpful to think about with national parks versus national forests and fires is I often think of national parks not only as these awesome places that we get to go and visit and experience. I was just at Mount Rainier with my 3-year-old last weekend in the quasi-rain that was going on, and it was awesome. They're great places to experience, but they're also living natural laboratories for us to have our best understanding of how ecosystems are going to respond in the absence of very active manipulative management. And that's a very different context, obviously, in national forests. There's a lot more different things that national forests are managed for, and so a lot of national parks are in a context where you can actually let fires burn, and while that is sometimes very societally challenging from a smoke production standpoint, it's oftentimes very much in tune with the ecological adaptations of a lot of the vegetation and animals in national parks. And so I do a lot of my work in national parks, actually, and I often think about them as some of our last remaining places on the planet for us to understand the natural dynamics of the ecosystems that we know and love by letting things like natural disturbances, like fire is one of, actually play their course and watch how the system responds without management to then inform how we would do more active management in other land contexts, such as private forests, other public forests, where there's a lot more in the equation of what we're managing for in these areas.
Well, okay, so that's really interesting. So jumping off of that, I'm wondering, did Smokey the Bear ruin me? Did it ruin us? I mean, as a communicator, do you think and Heidi, this is for you too. We receive these messages about, us being able to prevent forest fires. Like forest fires are bad. I think most of us get this view as forest fires is bad. And so we had a question from the audience about, if fire is not bad, then why do we hear these messages about fires being severe and catastrophic? Is that just a messaging issue?
Well, let's tag team that one. I'll just segue in from what I was saying is I think one really important thing to recognize is that a fire can sometimes be societally catastrophic and societally very severe in how it affects humans, and actually ecologically sort of business as usual, and not anything that's going to threaten the integrity of that ecosystem. And in fact, a lot of the Western U.S. is in that context. Even in sometimes what we think of as ecologically, look at this mega fire. It's crazy. The ecosystem is going to bounce back and perhaps be okay. But that's not the same thing as societally how we interact with that fire and the impacts of that fire. And so sometimes that mismatch can be a real struggle where the messaging gets lumped into one or the other. And it's often a lot more complex. So I don't know if you want to add to that.
Sure, from the human side. Or what are you, a robot? I don't know if you heard him, but under the breast, like, you can take that from the human side. Coming near you here. So I think Smokey the Bear, unfortunately, one of his bigger problems is he's created a grammar spelling issue in society. Smokey the Bear is spelled with an EY. Smokey is spelled absent the E, just for those of you out there who are writing about smoky skies. Different. It's my favorite tweet this summer, a reporter who said, to all my reporter friends, Smokey the Bear is spelled with an E. Smoky skies do not have an E in them. Anyway, I love that. So in terms of Smokey the Bear himself, jokes aside, that's unfortunate. I think there's a conversation, an important conversation about communication it involves how we message about fire and our role in fire, but I think there's a really, really central issue, which is communication around how we respond to the impacts of fire. And we've been talking about smoke here tonight because that's a theme, right? But people are also, their lives can be threatened by wildfire, right? It's not just smoke. Smoke isn't the only consequence, right? You can, in Eastern Washington, they will tell you the smoke is often the least of their concerns. They're concerned about the fire licking flames at their rooftops, right? That is another important communication challenge, which is what do you do not only when the air you're breathing is of poor quality or unhealthy quality or extremely unhealthy quality, but is what do you do when there's a fire on your doorstep? And unfortunately, not everyone has equal access to that information for a variety of reasons. Where the information is delivered, the channel upon which it's delivered, the language in which it's communicated. These are all really important things that I know that emergency managers in our state, forest managers, health practitioners, they're all thinking about how to do that. So I think this is in true spirit to the question, but I think there are, at the heart of how we communicate about wildfire, some really central questions about how do we make basic information accessible. I knew that the response from the Department of Health in Washington State was, in severe smoke conditions, close your windows, purify your air if you can, preferably with a HEPA filter. If it's hot, somehow climate control your air. Most of us know that we don't have air conditioners, so that's like, out the door, I don't have that. But I could probably go buy one if I really needed to. And again, that is also an issue that starts to raise issues of equity and access. And not everyone has that information. I think there are intentional and really meaningful attempts at that, but there is needed conversation to continue to figure out how we do better, right? And that onus falls to me too. How do I communicate more effectively about future climate and what that means for wildfire, as well as a myriad of other climate impacts we expect to experience?
So there's two kinds of people who are worried about fire. Those who have their second homes in a beautiful ski resort, I don't care about those. The part that I do care about is those who have been pushed out of other areas and are looking for a cheaper place to build their home. Those I do care about. And those may simply need some help in moving to a place where they would be less concerned about fire. So I agree with Brian, forest will come back, humans, of course humans will come back as well, right? As a race we're resistant and resilient, but we as a society may need to find resources to help those who have been pushed into those fire-prone areas because of the high housing costs. Here I'm specifically talking California. We may have to find ways of helping them.
You can clap for that. That's good. Especially the part about people with ski lodges. That's so we got a question. We actually had a couple of questions for Nivis because you brought up the issue of the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, and a couple of folks in the audience wanted to hear a little bit more about that and the trade-offs that go along with wildfire management and the ESA.
Thank you for the questions. Keep in mind I'm a social scientist, I'm not an ecologist. So I'm simply, my thinking about these issues is there going to be a conflict and how will we resolve the conflict and who will help us understand and resolve the conflict? I've been reading some work that has been coming out of Oregon Department of Natural Resources and Forest Management, and they are seeing relationship between having to preserve the environment for the Endangered Species Act and that leading to certain practices that keep the fuel, and on the other hand, those practices that keep the fuel increase the intensity and likelihood of fire. So that's what I've seen coming work out of Oregon. And as a political scientist, I'm thinking there's a conflict and we will have to resolve this conflict. And we will need environmental NGOs to help us understand what's at stake, and we'll have to have these conversations to tell those who enforce ESA for us that maybe we're willing to give up a little bit on the ESA side. I'm not saying that we are willing to. I'm saying we will have to have these conversations, and we may have to give a signal that it's okay to give in a little on the ESA side just to have less of a risk of forest fires.
You know, one of the points I was trying to make in some of the photographs that I was showing is that forest ecosystems are widely different, and even non-forest ecosystems, and the adaptations to fire are different in those systems. And so in some systems, trying to reduce catastrophic fire is going to be really a win-win for protecting human structures, safety, the integrity of the forest, and the native species in those forests. In other systems, that becomes a little bit decoupled in a lot of ways, and you know, a lot of species are adapted to fire across the whole gradient of fire. And so I think as a society, one of the more challenging things is figuring out how to grapple with that, because as a human society, it's a little bit harder to say, okay, yeah, I'm going to be adapted to really high severity fire when it comes. You know, but the natural ecosystems have this sort of full menu of different adaptations that they have evolved over a really long time, where they've been living on a flammable planet. And so I think we're only going to come to have to grapple with that more and more when we think about one way to put it is the forest that we all know and love and identify so much with in places like the Pacific Northwest. Oftentimes we're born of fires that are really problematic for us as people, but are absolutely critical for a lot of the native ecosystems that we identify with and love to experience in different ways, and really kind of typify the region for a number of different ways.
And I'll just add, I I echo what you say. As a human, I echo what you say.
Now from the human.
Yes. But I think an important element of that is that we know that we're changing those systems, right? We know that species are moving in response to a warming planet. We know that they're moving up in elevation and they're moving out of regions seeking safer or those similar environments to which they're adapted, and we observe those systems in transition. And I think just circling back to one of the first questions, which was about National Park Service versus Forest Service lands and how we manage them, these conversations tend to be downers, so I'm going to just put a little hope bomb out there, which is that we are in a privilege of place, which that it turns out every national forest in Oregon and Washington is considering how to incorporate climate change into its long-range planning, which has implications not for just us as humans, right? They don't just think about like what's best for humans. They actively think about and use science to say, well, what does the future bear for this forest? So the nuances that Brian has talked about that have been so informative, and I've learned a lot about, as a human, I've learned a lot from you today, Mr. Robot, about chaparral and ponderosa. No, jokes aside. Right, those nuances matter, and it turns out there are people who are taking those nuances into consideration to figure out what's best. Not on a large scale, but in fact on small forest by forest scales, which is what we're, I think, in essence, arguing on the science side matters. Considering those nuances matters for how you manage forests for ecosystems and how you manage them to have the least negative consequences for us in a changing climate. What is less feasible is policies for every national forest, which Olive would point out is not possible nor effective, right? And so that's where the challenge comes into play between the earth scientists and, I don't know, what do you call yourself? Robot man? Tree robot. And our political savvy counterpart over here who tries to center us in reality. Right, there's this balance, and that balance is really important. But people are doing important things and having important conversations that take these nuances into consideration.
Very good. So, actually, I have a couple of questions. I have some questions that are more focused on the human side for the humans, and I have some forest type questions. Since you have the microphone in your hand, Heidi, this might be a question for you. One of our audience members asks if summer precipitation has changed in a meaningful way in Western Washington. Have we seen this occurring already? Have we seen meaningful changes in precipitation already? And is this sort of boding towards what we expect in the future?
Specifically, precipitation.
Precipitation.
Yes. Throwing the hard card. Precipitation is a really difficult variable. On an annual scale, so trends in precipitation themselves are difficult for a variety of reasons. Look at me being a scientist who's wavering here. But so when we think about trends in precipitation, this is a perfect plug. So the Office of the Washington State Climatologist just published last week a brand new online data visualization of all the weather stations in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, and you can station by station click and look at both temperature trends and precipitation trends. So I'm not going to pretend that I have all of those thousands and thousands of data points in my head, but I think the main, you can go look for yourselves, and I'm happy to give you the URL for that website. You can look at those trends station by station, but also in relation to statewide averages or regional averages. But it's the seasonal changes in precipitation that really matter as we look towards the future. So we expect summer precipitation, which in the context of this conversation about forests and wildfire is the season that matters, and we do expect precipitation, slight decreases in precipitation in the future in the summer. So I'm happy to talk to you about the nuances of precipitation as a variable, but yes, the answer is yes, we expect to see less precipitation, and depending on where you're asking about, even in Western Washington, we could talk about the trends in precipitation offline, but I don't know if Brian, you have something you'd like to add? Yeah.
Great. Very good. Okay, so this question maybe is for Davis. Audience asks, we all have limited time, obviously. We want to get the most bang for our buck.
I get the hint. I get the hint.
You get the hint. All right. No. Oh, gosh. You're too quick for me. She's too quick for me. You can take all the time you want on this
Thank
question.
you.
So the question is local, state, or federal policy the most important to focus on if we were going to choose a place to take action?
Very good question. And to be honest and true to my training and to a person who probably invented the word polycentricity, which was Elinor Ostrom, I would say all of them are important. And the reason that all of them are important is that forests are owned by different entities. Definitely federal policy has to be there for forests that are owned by the federal government. State policy has to be there for forests that are owned by a state. Local policy has to be there for private forest owners. And maybe it's not just the governments, maybe again it's us as consumers saying, from now on when I'm buying forest and paper products, I will make sure that I always buy SFI certified, because I know that those are the best practices that environmental NGOs and the industry together have developed. So again, yes, governments are extremely important, but I would like to remind us all that we as consumers also have a say, and it's SFI. Sustainable Forestry Initiative. There's a seal on every product that's either of wood or of paper if it is SFI certified, so we can vote with our dollars as well.
That was very concise.
Can I add something?
Yeah, you have less time though.
Okay. My quick spiel, I think, and you can disagree with me, I think putting your efforts into political action at any level matter. Being an engaged citizen matters, right? That's a privilege. And I think that importantly, when we are developing sound, smart policies, even if they are not necessarily at the federal scale, other states and other regions and other decision makers look to leaders in the field to figure out how to craft smart policies and policies that win. And so sometimes the size doesn't really matter because there are eyes and ears, and we live in a world where information is shared widely. And so even small efforts or policies that may seem small, there are people looking for leaders, and leaders will be the ones that champion change, not just in one state or in one community, but that can scale up to national and global policy as well.
Great. Well, since you brought up during your presentations, actually I think many of you did, this idea that from the human dimension, we're going to be impacted in different ways. Different communities are going to be impacted in different ways. And we had a question from one of our audience members about our community that lives outside. So we have quite a few people who live outdoors in Seattle. And what can be done to protect that community of people? And is there advice or guidance that can be provided to cities on how to protect that community?
I'm not aware of policies that we have in Seattle. There are cities that have severe air pollution. There are cities on the northeast side of the United States that have severe air pollution. So we could look for best practices there. The least what we should be able to offer as a society is some sort of temporary shelter, because if we're telling everyone who's older and has any kind of health restrictions or limitations, do not be outdoors, we should definitely help those who permanently or at least for a longer period live outdoors. Again, I think we need to come up with some temporary shelter for that 1 week, 2 weeks when we're facing this situation. Don't ask me how we'll pay for it, but I think we should do it.
I mean, I would agree. We obviously need to pay for that, and we need to make facilities accessible, and I think that extends not only, importantly to populations who live outdoors, but to populations who also don't necessarily have access to information or resources that allow them to respond in a way that reduces the negative health consequences for individuals, right? There are individuals who are prone, who are already limited in their access to healthcare, or don't know or don't have close proximal access to facilities that offer, say, cool air or filtered air, and this extends into impacts like extreme heat. What do you do? Where do you go? And I think, for some of us, that's a question we ask that maybe isn't so pressing, but making sure, A, those facilities exist is a huge step in the right direction, and that those who need those facilities know that they're available and that they remain available.
Not everybody has in-laws that they can go to.
That they want to be stuck with.
Well, yeah. So, Brian, I think you mentioned the idea previously. You were talking about, obviously you were talking about forest management in many different areas. And one of the questions we had is whether or not we might expect larger, more intense forest fires in western Washington, like we've seen elsewhere.
Yeah, so I think on the west side of the Cascades, it's easy for us to not think of fire as a problem that we are encountered with in the same way that folks on the east side of the Cascades in the warmer, drier part of the state experience fire. If you look at a map of fire since the mid-1980s, and we have good satellite data of fire perimeters, it's unbelievable. If you look at the Cascade crest, it's all on the east side, and there's little tiny blips on the west side of the Cascades. And that can lead to a little bit of a sense of, it's not a problem that we need to worry about in our backyards on this side of the Cascades. However, kind of building on what I was saying before, a lot of the forests that we know and love on the west side of the Cascades were born following big fires of yesteryear. And if you sort of backed that timeline up and looked at a map of fire occurrence in Washington, you'd see that in the past, during warmer and drier periods, there were very large and very severe fires that really are characteristic of a lot of the forests in the sort of Douglas fir zone that we think of that characterizes the west side of the state and much of it. Those forests, again, are fairly well adapted to those kind of events happening on that long sort of boom and bust cycle. But the recent history of that is not sort of seared into our minds in the same way that it is in eastern Washington in the last several decades. However, going back to the earlier parts of the 1900s, there were big fires of several 100,000 acres that occurred on the west side of the Cascades. The Tillamook burn in Oregon, the Yakult burn in southern Washington, that you almost wouldn't recognize today because, again, 100 years later, the forests have grown back. So it is reasonable to assume that continued warming and drying and an increase in the sorts of conditions that are conducive to those fires happening is going to bring a greater probability of fire on the west side. And in fact, the research that has looked into that, this is not research that I've done, but other folks affiliated with agencies and universities in the region, suggests that we're going to be seeing a doubling or tripling of area burned on the west side of the Cascades, depending on where you are, relative to what we've seen in the last 100 years or so. And so, again, it's important for us to kind of have that in the back of our mind, that fire has played a very big role in structuring these forests on the west side, but in a very different way than the frequent fire, sort of low severity fire historically played on the east side of the Cascades. It is a boom and bust system, ecologically speaking, on the west side of the Cascades. And so we've been in a little bit of a bust period in the last several decades, but we're starting to see conditions that are very likely going to increase the probability of big fire potential on the west side of the Cascades.
Interesting. I'm going to go with this next question because the person wrote it in all caps with exclamation points. So it's a very important question for someone. For the robot. It says, please ask this of the robot. Is there any sort of connection between climate change and the spread of invasive species in forests, such as the pine bark beetle?
An all caps question. I'll give an all caps answer. Yeah, here we go. So actually, that's one of the the main misunderstandings, I think, that I hear a lot about the mountain pine beetle outbreak and other insect outbreaks in forests, much like fire, most of the sort of big beetle outbreaks that we think of, mountain pine beetle, spruce beetle, Douglas fir beetle, the ones that have really impacted forests on the western half of the US, most of those are native species and actually play a very important role in also maintaining the structure and function of those forests. So that part I think is important to understand, that we wouldn't want to get rid of insects like mountain pine beetles in forests the same way that we probably wouldn't want to get rid of fire unless we're ready to make a decision to make sort of wholesale changes to how these ecosystems operate, because they're very integral parts of those ecosystems and are native organisms that have been there for millennia, and the trees as well as other organisms have adapted to those things. However, the answer to should we expect more of those in the future is in some ways similar to the question of should we expect more fire in the future, and that warm temperatures and dry conditions are conditions that are one key ingredient to things like insect outbreaks, for different reasons than fire, but it's also a key ingredient to fire. And one of those key things is that those warm temperatures have an impact on the population cycle of those beetles and can actually speed up the population growth of those beetles, as well at the same time stressing trees during warm, dry, drought conditions. And so you sort of have two key pieces that lead to those beetle outbreaks. One thing I will say with beetle outbreaks is there's also a lot of what we call negative feedbacks built into the cycle. So not negative in a value-laden way, but in terms of if you have a beetle outbreak this year in a forest, you have a low likelihood of having that next year in the forest, because the beetle outbreak can only happen so long as that there are large, live, susceptible trees of their host species. And so a lot of the areas that you see in the western, blanketing western North America that have had really severe beetle outbreaks in recent decades are actually not likely to have those same beetle outbreaks for quite a while until that forest sort of regains the condition of large host trees that are available and then stressed in the future. And so that warming condition could lead to continual stress of those trees in the future. But there are also really key feedbacks between the beetles and what they eat, which is the trees. And so once they've eaten all the trees that they can attack, they don't have as much of that resource available to them, and so their populations then crash. So kind of interesting, but certainly climate is one key ingredient in that disturbance as well.
Interesting. Well, y'all, we have a lot of note cards in here, a lot of questions, but I definitely want to give you all a chance to talk with the audience directly. And I just have one big sort of overarching philosophical question that was actually suggested by the human on the panel. But what do you? we'll make Brian go first though. What is it that you wish for out of an event like this? When we have these conversations about issues like this, what do you wish for the future?
I'm going to step outside of my robot phase here and big picture. I really wish that we can have healthy societal dialogue where we're having discussions about this that are informed by the best available science as one piece of the decision-making process, and that is a foundation upon which we can have these discussions. And so I think it's a brave new world that we're entering, where precisely predicting what that world might look like and what might actually be possible in terms of kind of the social ecological environment that we look in, that we're looking to. We have a lot of ability to shape that future, and I just hope that we can have healthy dialogue about that, where science is one key piece of information that's at the table when those discussions are being made. How's that for a robot answer?
You stole my human answer. Just like a robot would. You were coded to do that. No, I think, this is, why did I ask you to ask this question?
I thought you already had an answer.
I thought
it was a softball. I was going to toss for you.
No, I mean, I think we've discussed a lot of dimensions of one of the many impacts of climate, and climate is one of the many concerns that exists in society, and it's not necessarily the first and foremost concern, right? There are a lot of other things that happen in the world. I happen to spend my days mired in climate. We call it the gray cloud of doom, right? And half jokingly. And I think that climate being part of the conversation, and that science is part of and a central part of the decision making and the dialogue around climate would be great. But I think it's also about how we make that conversation more inclusive. And informed dialogue also requires authentic listening and genuine engagement. And I think crafting and coming up with inclusive policies or solutions requires that we make ourselves uncomfortable and have conversations, and difficult conversations, with people who experience and view the world differently than we do. And that's a challenge that I embrace every day. We were talking about this in our office today, actually. We have these climate and communications coffee chats, right? And where we talk about the challenges that we face in communicating and how we might do it better and what are the concerns. And I think what I would like is for myself and for us all is to engage in that dialogue, but maybe engage in places where it's not so familiar and so comfortable, but we do that with open hearts and open minds, with the real intention of trying to come up with solutions that are actionable and that matter and that have an impact.
How much time do we have for all the wishes? I wish that all the people who are sitting here continue doing what we're doing, and that is meeting and making decisions both with our heart and with our reason, rather than along the political party lines. Environmental decisions are too important, but have unfortunately become ideological and political divider. And I wish that we would stop doing this in the United States, and again, that we would make decisions with our heart and with the reason, rather than with the political party that we vote for. So that's my first wish. I just have two. And the second wish is that we put the right people into the government, so that the government creates the incentives that guide the right decisions. So that those of us who do protect the environment don't feel that we are, this is the technical term from my literature, it's called the sucker. So that those of us who are, all of us here, who are doing the right thing, and that is what's environmentally responsible, that we finally have governments who recognize this and create incentives that recognize what we're doing, or at least make those who don't do what's right pay for it. Those are my two wishes.
Well, those are great wishes. Yeah. So thank you all for your, I want to thank the whole panel here for all that they've had to say.